The dust had not yet settled on the main street of Callow Creek, Texas, when Sarah Turner stepped off the southbound stagecoach on a blazing Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1874, and every man within eyeshot forgot, at least momentarily, what he had been doing. She was not the kind of woman who sought that sort of attention. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a sun-faded bonnet, and green eyes that carried the particular weight of someone who had known genuine hardship without letting it make her cruel. She wore a practical traveling dress of deep brown wool, slightly too warm for a Texas summer, and she carried a single leather trunk that she had managed entirely on her own before the stagecoach driver even thought to offer his hand. Her jaw was set with the quiet determination of a woman who had made a decision and intended to see it through, regardless of what the world thought about it. Callow Creek was not a large town, but it was a real one. It had a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Claudette Haynes who knew everyone's business and was generally correct about it. There was a saloon called the Red Lantern, a church with a bell that rang on Sundays whether the congregation felt like it or not, a livery stable, a telegraph office, a schoolhouse, and a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's office when the need arose. The population was somewhere around 300 souls, depending on the season and whether you counted the men who worked the cattle drives that passed through twice yearly. It sat at the edge of nowhere and the beginning of something, the way so many Western towns did in those years, balanced between the wildness of the open land and the ambition of civilization still trying to put down roots. Sarah had come to Callow Creek because her aunt, Martha Prout, had written her a letter 6 weeks prior explaining that the town was in need of a schoolteacher, and that the position came with a small salary and a room above the general store. Sarah had been in Missouri at the time, working as a seamstress in a shop that paid her poorly and treated her worse, living in a boarding house where the landlord knocked on her door for the rent 3 days before it was due every single month. The letter from Aunt Martha had felt like a door opening when she had not even realized she had been standing in a corridor. She had written back within the week. She had accepted the position within 2. Standing now on the main street of Callow Creek with the stagecoach pulling away and the July heat pressing down like a heavy hand, Sarah looked at the town around her and felt a complicated mixture of hope and nervousness settle in her chest. She reminded herself of something her father had told her before he passed, which was that the only way to make a strange place feel like home was to treat it like one before it had earned the title. She squared her shoulders, picked up her trunk, and went to find her aunt. Martha Prout was a small, round woman of 52 with iron-gray hair and an energy that made you tired just watching her. She ran the general store with the precision of a military commander and the warmth of a grandmother, and she was genuinely delighted to see Sarah, pulling her into an embrace that lasted a full 30 seconds before she stepped back and held her niece at arm's length to look at her properly. "You're thinner than your mother was," Martha said, which was her way of saying she intended to feed Sarah well. "I'm perfectly healthy," Sarah said. "You're thinner than your mother was," Martha repeated, as though Sarah had not spoken at all, and then she took Sarah's trunk without apparent effort and led her inside. The room above the general store was small but clean. It had a window that faced east, which meant good morning light, and a narrow bed with a quilt Martha had made herself from old dress fabric. There was a wash basin, a modest writing desk, and a hook behind the door for a coat. It was the most purely comfortable space Sarah had occupied in 3 years, and she sat on the edge of the bed that first afternoon and felt, for the first time in a long while, that she might be all right. Martha sat in the one chair the room possessed and told Sarah everything she needed to know about Callow Creek in the particular way she had, which was to say she wove it all together with opinions and history and gossip, until Sarah was not entirely sure which parts were fact and which were editorial. She learned that the schoolhouse had been without a teacher since the spring, when the previous one, a young man named Foster, had gone to California on account of his lungs. She learned that the town's mayor was a portly man named Gerald Whitmore, who was generally well-intentioned but chronically indecisive. She learned that the Red Lantern Saloon was run by a man named Hector Baines, who was fair in his dealings and kept relatively good order for a saloon, which Martha considered a minor miracle. And she learned about Benjamin Dalton. She did not learn about him all at once. Martha mentioned him the way you mention weather, as something simply present and worth noting. He was, Martha said, a rancher who owned the Dalton spread about 4 miles east of town. He ran cattle, had a small crew of cowhands, and was generally regarded as the most reliable man in the county when it came to being true to his word. He was 28 years old. He had come to Texas from Kentucky 6 years prior, had bought a failing ranch from a man going back east, and had built it into something real through the kind of sustained, unglamorous hard work that does not make for good stories but makes for genuine results. "Is he married?" Sarah asked, and then immediately felt embarrassed for asking, because she had asked it too quickly. Martha's eyes had the particular brightness of a woman who had noted something important. "He is not," she said pleasantly, and moved on to describing the church's summer social, which was coming up in 3 weeks. Sarah put Benjamin Dalton out of her mind. She had come to Callow Creek to teach school and to build something for herself, not to look for a husband. She had watched women in Missouri make marriages out of desperation and poverty rather than genuine affection, and she had decided, with the quiet resolution that characterized most of her decisions, that she would rather be alone and self-sufficient than coupled and miserable. She met him 4 days after her arrival, and he was nothing like what she had built up in her mind, which was to say she had built nothing in her mind at all and was therefore unprepared. She was in the general store, helping Martha inventory a new shipment of dry goods that had come in on the freight wagon, when the door opened, and a man ducked his head slightly to clear the frame, not because the frame was particularly low, but because he was in the habit of it, the kind of man who had learned through experience to be careful about his height in enclosed spaces. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. He wore a working rancher's clothes, practical and dusty, and he carried his hat in his hand the moment he stepped inside, which Sarah noticed because not every man thought to do that. He greeted Martha by name and with genuine warmth, and Martha greeted him back with the particular tone she reserved for people she actually liked, and then he turned and saw Sarah, and there was a moment, brief and immediate, where something in his expression shifted in a way he clearly did not intend to show. "This is my niece, Sarah Turner," Martha said, with a pleasantness that contained multitudes. "She's come to teach at the schoolhouse." "Benjamin Dalton," he said, and extended his hand. His handshake was firm and direct, the kind of handshake that communicated something about a person's character more efficiently than most conversation. "Mr. Dalton," Sarah said. "Ben," he said. There was a brief silence that was not uncomfortable so much as full of something neither of them had names for yet. He had come in for flour and salt and a length of rope, and he made his purchases without lingering, though he did ask Sarah, with genuine curiosity rather than the forced politeness of a man performing interest, how she found Texas compared to Missouri. She told him honestly that she found it considerably hotter and considerably larger, and that she had not yet determined whether those were good things or simply facts. He laughed at that, a real laugh, low and unguarded, and said that was a fair assessment and that it tended to grow on you. He left, and Martha said nothing at all, which from Martha said everything. The schoolhouse opened on the first Monday of August with 11 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Sarah threw herself into the work with a focus that was partly genuine vocation and partly a productive way to manage the strange restlessness she had been feeling since arriving in Callow Creek, a restlessness she was careful not to examine too closely because she suspected she knew its source. She was a good teacher. She had a patience that came not from disposition alone, but from having thought carefully about what it meant to help someone learn, and the children of Callow Creek responded to her with the instinctive trust that children give to adults who treat them as intelligent beings worthy of real effort. Within 2 weeks, she had learned all their names and their particular ways of thinking, and the things that made them light up or shut down, and she had adjusted her teaching accordingly. She saw Benjamin Dalton at church on Sundays, where he sat 3 pews behind her and always, she noticed, arrived on time and stayed for the full service. They would exchange greetings at the door afterward, brief and pleasant conversations that somehow always lasted longer than they were supposed to, drifting from weather to cattle prices to books to local history, while the rest of the congregation dispersed around them. He had read more than she had expected. He had a particular fondness for history and for accounts of exploration, and he could talk about the lay of the land in a way that made it seem like a living thing with its own character and logic. Sarah, whose father had been a schoolteacher before his health failed, had grown up in a house with books and had her own firm opinions about literature and ideas, and she found that conversations with Benjamin Dalton required her to actually think rather than simply respond, which was rarer than it should have been. She began to look forward to Sunday mornings in a way that was not entirely about the sermon. It was in September, about 6 weeks after her arrival, that the circumstances of the town conspired to bring them into more sustained contact. A fever went through Callow Creek in the 2nd week of the month, the kind of autumn sickness that was not life-threatening but was miserable and contagious, and it laid low a considerable portion of the population, including Martha Prout herself, who was entirely furious about being unwell, and was, by Sarah's estimate, the most difficult patient a person could ever attend to. Sarah closed the schoolhouse for a week and nursed her aunt with determination and genuine affection. The fever broke within 4 days, but Martha was ordered by the doctor, a quiet German man named Dr. Brauer, to rest for another week at minimum, which Martha agreed to under vocal protest. During this time, Benjamin Dalton appeared at the store on 3 separate occasions, bringing things. The first time he brought eggs from his ranch, a full 2 dozen, which he presented at the door with the uncomplicated generosity of a man who simply sees a need and responds to it. The second time he brought a bottle of medicinal honey and a small crock of broth that his housekeeper, an older Mexican woman named Consuela, had made. The third time he came empty-handed but offered to bring in the supply wagon from the freight station, because Sarah's usual driver was also ill, and she accepted because she genuinely needed the help, and because she had given up pretending she was not glad to see him. They spent 2 hours moving boxes and crates from the freight wagon into the storeroom together, working with the easy efficiency of 2 people who were both physically capable and practically minded. And the conversation they had while doing it was the best conversation Sarah could remember having in years. They talked about education, and he surprised her with his conviction that the children of working ranchers deserved the same quality of teaching as the children of wealthy landowners, a conviction he held with the particular quiet certainty of someone who had come from modest origins himself. They talked about what Texas might look like in 20 years, and whether the cattle drives would still be running, and what the railroad would do to the territory when it came through. They talked about Kentucky, which he had loved and left, and Missouri, which Sarah had left without much love at all. When the work was done, they stood in the doorway of the storeroom, and the afternoon light came through the high small window and fell across the dust in the air, and Benjamin Dalton looked at her with an expression that was open in a way that men's expressions rarely were, unguarded and honest and a little uncertain, and said, "I would very much like to call on you properly, Miss Turner, if you'd have no objection to it." Sarah looked at him for a moment. She thought about Missouri and the boarding house and the seamstress work and all the small indignities of a life where she had been making the best of a situation she had not chosen. She thought about what she had told herself about not coming here to look for a husband, and then she thought that calling on someone and marrying someone were 2 very different things, and that she had been having the best afternoon she could remember, and that she was 24 years old and had every right to enjoy decent company. "I have no objection to it," she said, and the smile that moved across Benjamin Dalton's face was the kind that made the whole room warmer. He called on her the following Saturday afternoon, arriving at the general store with his hat in his hand, and his hair actually combed, which Martha, watching from behind the counter with a cup of tea she was using as cover, found immensely satisfying. He and Sarah walked along the main street of Callow Creek and out to the edge of town, where the land opened up into the wide, golden grass expanse of the Texas plain, and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, the particular kind of conversation that is really a series of small discoveries, each one adding to the growing understanding that this person is interesting, this person is real, this person is worth knowing. He told her about how he had come to Texas. He had been the second son of a Kentucky farming family, which meant there was not much land waiting for him, and he had made the decision at 22, after 3 years of working his father's farm and saving every cent he could, to go west and find his own ground. It had not been romantic. It had been hard and lonely, and there had been a particular winter, his second one on the ranch, when the cattle fever had taken a third of his herd, and he had sat in his kitchen in the dark and genuinely wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But he had stayed. He had rebuilt. And the land that had fought him was now, he said, the thing he loved most in the world, partly because of all it had cost him. "The things you work hardest for," Sarah said, "are the ones that mean the most. My father said that, and I thought it was just something fathers say until I found out it was actually true." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Benjamin said. "He was," Sarah said simply, and there was carried its own weight in the conversation, and Benjamin heard it and did not press, which she appreciated. She told him about her father's illness and death, which had happened 3 years ago and had changed everything. Her mother had passed when Sarah was young, and her father had been the whole of her family for most of her life. A gentle, bookish man who had worked as a schoolteacher in a small Missouri town, and raised his daughter with the quiet conviction that intelligence was not a gendered quality, and that learning was the most important thing he could give her. When he died, she had been 21 and suddenly without the support that had made her world make sense, and she had worked the seamstress job and the boarding house and the years of making do, waiting, though she had not known quite what she was waiting for. "And then your aunt's letter came," Benjamin said. "And then Aunt Martha's letter came," Sarah agreed. They were standing at the edge of the town now, with the sun beginning its long western descent and the light turning the dry grass into something that looked almost like gold, and Benjamin Dalton was looking at her with a steadiness and a warmth that she had to actively resist leaning into because she was not ready to lean, not yet, not when everything was still so new. "I'm glad it did," he said, simply and directly, the way he said most things. "So am I," she said, and meant it. He walked her back to the general store, and at the door he said he hoped she might be willing to walk with him again, and she said she thought she could find the time, and they both understood that this was the beginning of something real. The weeks that followed had a quality Sarah would later struggle to describe, even to herself. It was not the giddy, disorienting sensation she had read about in novels, though there were certainly moments of something adjacent to giddiness. It was more solid than that, more grounded. It was the steady, accumulating sense of someone becoming known to you, the particular intimacy of learning a person's habits and preferences and principles through sustained observation and genuine conversation. Benjamin called on her every Saturday and sometimes on Wednesday evenings, when the work on the ranch allowed it. He met her after church on Sundays and walked with her, and Martha Prout, who had the strategic wisdom to give them appropriate privacy while remaining thoroughly aware of everything, found reasons to be occupied elsewhere during these visits. He took her to see his ranch in October, on a Saturday afternoon when the weather had turned crisp, and the sky was the particular clear blue that Texas produces in the fall as though making up for the summer. He rode alongside the small buggy he had borrowed from the livery stable, because he had thought to bring a conveyance she could ride in rather than expecting her to ride horseback without knowing her preference, which she noted as the kind of thoughtfulness that revealed character. The Dalton ranch was not grand, but it had an integrity to it that she could see immediately. The fences were maintained, the barn was solid, the house was modest but well built with a covered porch that faced west to catch the evening light. There was a kitchen garden that showed signs of genuine care, and Consuela, who kept the house and fed the hands, came out to greet them with the frank, assessing look of a woman who had known Benjamin Dalton for years and considered herself entitled to an opinion about the people in his life. Consuela's opinion, Sarah gathered by the end of the afternoon, was cautiously positive and tending favorable. She had fed them both her excellent tamales and asked Sarah direct questions about her background and opinions with a frankness that Sarah found refreshing rather than alarming. Consuela had been born in Mexico and had come north with her husband 30 years ago, had raised 4 children in Texas, and had outlived her husband and settled into a competent independence that she wore with the ease of long habit. She and Benjamin had an affectionate, plainly spoken relationship, and watching them together told Sarah more about who Benjamin Dalton was than anything he had said directly. Walking back from the barn, where he had shown her the horses with the particular delight of a man who loves the things he works with, Benjamin said, "What do you think of it?" "I think it's real," Sarah said. "I think you built something real here." He stopped walking and looked at her, and in the long autumn afternoon light he looked very much like a man who was beginning to feel something large and was not entirely sure what to do about it. "I've been thinking," he said, and then stopped. "That's generally considered a good activity," she said. He laughed, the low, unguarded laugh she had come to recognize and look for. "I've been thinking that I am very glad you came to Callow Creek," he said, "and I've been thinking that I would like it very much if you stayed." It was not a proposal, they both understood that, but it was a direction, a pointing towards something, and Sarah felt it in her chest like a compass finding north. "I intend to stay," she said quietly. "This feels like a place worth staying in." They looked at each other for a moment in the afternoon light, and then they walked back to the house, and Consuela gave them coffee and didn't say a word, but her expression said everything. November in Callow Creek arrived with cold wind and the smell of wood smoke, and a busy, purposeful energy that came with the approach of the winter months. The cattle drive season had ended, and the town was fuller, men in from the ranches to restock and socialize, and rest before the long quiet of winter. The Red Lantern Saloon did considerable business, and the general store was busy from morning to evening, and Sarah's schoolhouse was full of children who were simultaneously energized by the changing season and thoroughly resistant to sitting still and learning mathematics. It was during this busy November that Sarah became aware of a tension in the town that she had not noticed before, or perhaps had noticed and not fully understood. There was a man named Clifton Rourke who had arrived in Callow Creek in October, having purchased a parcel of land adjoining Benjamin's ranch to the south. He was a land speculator, she gathered, the kind of man who moved through the West buying and selling property with an eye toward the railroad routes that were still being planned and fought over in the territorial legislature. He dressed better than most men in Callow Creek and had a smooth, careful way of talking that made most things sound reasonable even when they were not. The problem, which she pieced together gradually from conversations with Benjamin and Martha and the general intelligence of a small town, was that Rourke had been making offers on several small ranches in the area, pushing their prices down through methods that were legal but not exactly honest. And there was some question about whether he had a legitimate claim to the land he had purchased or whether there were title irregularities that he had exploited. Benjamin was not directly threatened yet, but several of his neighbors were, and he had been spending time in the evenings trying to help them understand their options. She saw this side of him clearly and found it entirely in keeping with what she already knew. He was not the kind of man who became heroic and grand in a crisis. He was the kind who got quietly, methodically involved and stayed involved until the problem was addressed. He helped an older rancher named Tom Garrett write letters to the land office in Austin. He consulted with the one lawyer in the county, a thin man named Abernathy who practiced out of an office above the bank. He talked to the other ranchers and organized a meeting at the church so everyone could compare what they knew. Sarah attended the meeting at his invitation because she had a clear head and was good at organizing information, and she sat in the back and took notes on what each person said, and afterward helped him see the pattern in the various accounts that made clear what Rourke was actually doing, which was exploiting the lack of consistent record-keeping in the county to make competing claims on properties whose original deeds were poorly documented. "You see things very clearly," Benjamin said, after the others had gone home and they were the last two left in the church, the candles burning low and the cold pressing against the windows. "You're doing the same," she said. "You're just also carrying the weight of everyone else's worry, which makes it harder to see." He looked at her with the expression she had been seeing more frequently lately, the one that was open and direct and a little stunned, as though he kept finding her more than he had expected. "Sarah," he said, and then stopped. "Benjamin," she said quietly and waited. He stood up and came to where she was sitting and reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had held her hand, and the simple warmth of it went through her with the particular force of something long anticipated. "I know it has only been 3 months," he said, "and I know that is not very long, and I am not trying to rush anything. But I need you to know that what I feel for you is not a small thing. It is not a temporary thing, and I want to be sure that you know that." Sarah looked at his hand holding hers, and then she looked up at his face, and she thought about the 3 months and all the conversations and all the small moments of discovery, and she thought that 3 months of truly knowing someone was worth more than years of surface-level acquaintance. "I know it," she said, "and what I feel for you is not a small thing either." The look on his face at that moment was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He did not kiss her that night. He was a man of genuine respect, and they were in the church, and Martha Prout had certain standards that he took seriously. But he walked her home with her hand on his arm and the cold wind around them, and a warmth between them that had nothing to do with temperature. And at the door of the general store, he held her hand and looked at her very steadily and said, "Good night, Sarah," with a weight in her name that made it mean something. "Good night, Benjamin," she said, and went inside and stood in the dark of the store for a moment before going upstairs, her heart doing something complicated and good. The situation with Clifton Rourke came to a head in December, which was faster than anyone had expected, but perhaps should not have been surprising given the nature of the man. He appeared one Thursday morning at Tom Garrett's property with 2 men, and a document that he claimed gave him the right to a portion of Garrett's pasture on the basis of an old competing survey. Garrett, who was 63 and not in the best health, did not know what to do and sent his hired hand riding into town for help. The hired hand went to Benjamin first, because that was what people did. Benjamin rode out within the hour, and Sarah, who heard about it from Martha while helping in the store that morning, felt a cold knot of anxiety in her chest that confirmed, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how much she cared about this man. She was not a woman who waited passively for news. She had the school to attend to, so she attended to it. But she taught that morning with one part of her attention on the children and one part on the road east of town. And when school ended at midday, she walked to Mrs. Haynes's, who was the clearing-house for all town news, and learned what had happened. Benjamin had arrived at Garrett's property and examined Rourke's document and identified, with the help of a copy of the original deed that Garrett kept in his house, a discrepancy in the survey dates that made Rourke's claim legally dubious at best. He had stated this calmly and clearly in front of witnesses. Rourke had pushed back with considerable confidence, and his two men had stood in a way that was meant to be intimidating. Benjamin had told Rourke, with the particular quietness of a man who is not intimidated and is simply being clear, that he was welcome to take his case to the land office in Austin, and that in the meantime, Tom Garrett's property remained Tom Garrett's property. Rourke had eventually left, and the general assessment in town was that he would either escalate through legal channels or move on to easier targets. When Benjamin came into the store late that afternoon, there was dust on his coat and a weariness around his eyes that came not from the physical work of the day, but from the sustained tension of dealing with a man who was both dishonest and legally sophisticated. He sat in the chair Martha indicated and accepted the coffee she produced, and looked at Sarah across the room with a tiredness that was also somehow trusting, the look of someone who is glad to be where they are. Sarah came and sat across from him, and they talked it through for an hour, and she helped him think about what Rourke's next move might be, and what documentation he should gather from the other ranchers before Rourke had time to complicate things further. By the end of the conversation, he was sitting straighter and his eyes were clearer, and Martha, who had been present the whole time under the guise of doing inventory, allowed herself a small private smile over her ledger book. "I don't know what I would do without you thinking alongside me," he said at the door before he left to ride back to the ranch. "You would think perfectly well on your own," she said. "You simply would not enjoy it as much." "No," he said, looking at her, "I would not." He left, and Martha closed her ledger book and said, without looking up, "He is going to ask you to marry him, and when he does, I hope you will have the good sense to say yes." "Martha," Sarah said. "I'm just noting what I observe," Martha said, and opened the ledger book again. December moved through Callow Creek with its particular combination of cold and preparation and community warmth that small western towns produced in winter, when the isolation of the open land drove people together rather than apart. There was a church social on the 15th, with dancing and food and the particular happiness of a community that was conscious of itself as a community. Benjamin danced with Sarah twice, which was the maximum that decorum permitted before people began to talk, and they both understood that people were talking anyway and were both privately all right with that. He was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him, and he said he had learned at a dance in Kentucky at 17 and had practiced intermittently since then, because he believed that a man who could not dance was at a disadvantage in any situation requiring grace and coordination, which made her laugh out loud. On Christmas Eve, the town gathered at the church for the candlelight service, and Benjamin sat beside Sarah in the pew, which Martha had arranged through a combination of strategic seating and judicious absence, and during the carols his arm was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of it, and once, briefly, his hand found hers in the low light and held it for the space of one verse of "O Holy Night," before they were both recalled to propriety. She thought, sitting there in that church in the candlelight with the voices of Callow Creek around her, that she had been wrong about what she had come here for. She had come for work and independence and the chance to build something of her own, and she had found all of those things. But she had also found something she had not looked for, something that was larger than she had expected and better than she had feared, and she sat in the warmth of it and let it be real. Christmas Day she spent with Martha and a group of the town's other women, and Benjamin sent over a small package with his ranch hand, a young man named Pete who was clearly dying of curiosity about it. The package contained a book, a collected volume of essays on natural history that he had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio because she had mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier that she was interested in the science of the land, the geology and the ecology of the Texas plains. It was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, and inside the cover he had written in his clear, careful hand, "For Sarah, who makes every landscape more interesting. With warmest regards, Benjamin." She read that inscription 4 times and then pressed the book to her chest for a moment, alone in her room above the store, and felt the particular fullness of knowing she was loved by someone worth being loved by. She wrote him a letter that afternoon, because she had sent his Christmas gift to the ranch the week before with a note, and she felt she owed him acknowledgement. She wrote a longer letter than she intended, 3 pages, and then edited it down to 1.5 because the 3-page version said things that ought to be said out loud rather than on paper. She thanked him for the book, and she told him she was reading it that evening, and she told him, in careful language, that the regard was entirely mutual. He arrived at the store on the 27th with the letter in his coat pocket and the expression of a man who has read something important several times. He sat with her and Martha, and they had tea and talked about the new year coming, and when Martha eventually found a reason to be elsewhere in the store, he looked at Sarah with a directness that made the room feel smaller. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the spring." "Yes," she said, "about what I want the spring to look like." He turned his hat in his hands. "About what I want my life to look like." Sarah was very still. "I know this is not the formal way of doing things," he said, "and I know I should perhaps talk to your aunt first, and I absolutely will, but I needed to tell you first that I love you, Sarah. I love you in a way that I did not expect and cannot contain and do not want to, and I want you to know that before I do anything formal about it." The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside and the distant sound of Martha moving boxes in the back of the store. "Benjamin," Sarah said softly. "I know," he said. "I know it is something that needs to be thought about properly and not rushed. I just needed you to know where I stand." She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had come from Kentucky to Texas with nothing but determination and had built something real, who had helped his neighbors without being asked to, who had brought eggs when her aunt was sick and listened to her opinions as though they were worth the time it took to understand them, who had ordered her a book about natural history because she mentioned in passing that she was curious about the land. "I love you too," she said, simply and directly, because simple and direct was the best language for true things. The look on his face was something she knew she would never entirely be able to describe. He did talk to Martha, the very next day, with the formal seriousness of a man who understood that form and respect mattered, and Martha listened to him with a gravity that was undermined by the fact that she had been anticipating this conversation for 2 months. She told him with equal seriousness that she had observed him carefully and that she believed him to be a good man who would treat her niece well, and that her blessing was conditional only on Sarah's own happiness, which she trusted would be the first priority. He thanked her with genuine feeling, and Martha made him sit down and have coffee and told him he'd better ask soon, because Callow Creek's winters were miserable, and a man in love had no business being miserable in a cold ranch house when there was a perfectly good woman willing to take him on. Benjamin laughed and said he took her point. January arrived, and the new year opened with a cold clarity that felt, at least to Sarah, like a beginning. She was teaching again, and the school children were back from their Christmas rest and full of news and restlessness in equal measure, and the days had a good full rhythm to them that she loved. She was reading the natural history book in her evenings and making notes in the margins, and she and Benjamin continued their walking and their talking, and the love between them had the quality now of something established rather than tentative, something they had both agreed to and were now simply living inside. He asked her on a Thursday afternoon in late January. She was not expecting Thursday. She had, she would later admit, been in a low-level state of pleasant anticipation for weeks, aware that the question was coming in general but not knowing the specific when or where of it. She had thought perhaps Sunday, after church. She had thought perhaps he might take her back to the ranch. She had not thought Thursday, in front of the general store, in the middle of the afternoon, with what turned out to be half the town of Callow Creek either present or very quickly becoming present. She had come out of the store to help Martha carry in a delivery of seed packets from the freight wagon. The main street was reasonably busy for a January afternoon, people moving in and out of the various establishments, a group of men talking outside the Red Lantern, Mrs. Haynes sweeping her porch 3 doors down. It was cold and bright, the kind of Texas winter day that is clear as glass and just as sharp. Benjamin Dalton rode down the main street at a pace that was unhurried but purposeful, and he dismounted in front of the general store and tied his horse to the post. And Sarah looked at him and knew immediately from the way he was carrying himself that something was different about this Thursday afternoon. He walked toward her with his hat in his hand and the look on his face that was the most open and certain she had ever seen on him, and he stopped about 3 feet from her, and the street around them was not empty, not even close to empty, but he did not look at the street at all. "Sarah," he said, loud enough that the word carried in the cold air. Mrs. Haynes had stopped sweeping. The men outside the Red Lantern had turned. Martha had appeared in the doorway of the store with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for months. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, small and plain and gold, the kind of ring that was not showy but was real, and he went down on one knee in the dust of the main street of Callow Creek, Texas, in the January cold of 1875, and he looked up at her with the whole town watching and began to speak. "Sarah Turner," he said, "I have loved you since about 3 minutes after I met you, though it took me several weeks to fully understand that was what was happening. You are the most genuinely interesting and good and clear-minded person I have ever known, and you make every single day better for being in it. I came to Texas to build something, and I have been building it, but it has taken me until now to understand that what I have been building needed you in it to make sense. You are not what I expected to find when I rode into Callow Creek, and I am grateful every day that Martha wrote you that letter because otherwise I would have spent the rest of my life not knowing what I was missing, and what I would have been missing is everything. Sarah, I want to spend the rest of my life talking with you and working beside you and raising whatever this life gives us together. I want you to be my wife. I want to ask you," and that was as far as he got, because Sarah Turner said yes. She said it clearly and firmly and without hesitation in the middle of his sentence, before he had finished the asking, before he had quite arrived at the formal question, because she did not need the formal question to know the answer. She had known the answer for weeks. She had known it if she was being perfectly honest with herself, since the afternoon in the storeroom when he had looked at her in the light coming through the high window and asked if he might call on her properly. Benjamin Dalton blinked up at her from his knee. "I haven't quite finished," he said, and there was laughter in his voice. "You don't need to," she said, and held out her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger, standing as he did, and the whole of Callow Creek that was within earshot erupted into noise, the cheering and hollering, and the particular joyful racket of a community that is genuinely happy about something. Mrs. Haynes clapped her hands together. The men outside the Red Lantern sent up a cheer that brought 2 more people out to see what the fuss was. Martha Pruitt appeared on the step of the store with both hands pressed to her mouth and tears running freely down her face, which was the most Martha Pruitt thing Sarah had ever seen. Benjamin looked at Sarah, and Sarah looked at Benjamin, and they were both laughing, the full, unguarded laughter of people who are happy in a way that has caught them a little off guard by its completeness. He pulled her close and she let him, right there in the middle of the main street with the whole town watching, and they stood together in the cold January light while Callow Creek celebrated around them. "I intended to have a longer speech," he said into her hair. "It was a very good speech," she said. "It communicated everything necessary. You are the most direct woman I have ever met," he said. "You knew that when you started falling in love with me," she said. "I did," he said. "And I was grateful for it then too." Martha descended from the step and embraced them both, and then began organizing everyone else into appropriate celebration, because Martha Pruitt had the instincts of a general, and a party was as good a use of them as anything else. The formal celebration happened that evening at the Red Lantern, which Hector Baines opened up for the community without charge, because that was the kind of thing that happened in Callow Creek, and the kind of man Hector Baines was. People brought food, and the saloon's piano was pressed into service, and the news had traveled through the town with the speed that important news always traveled in small places, which was to say almost instantly, and by the time Benjamin and Sarah arrived there was already a crowd. Tom Garrett shook Benjamin's hand with both of his and told him he had always known he had good sense, just not quite this much of it. Dr. Brower offered them both his congratulations in careful, formal English, and then surprised everyone by producing a bottle of his own schnapps for the occasion. The schoolchildren's parents came to offer their wishes, and old Reverend Calloway from the church came and declared that he looked forward to performing the ceremony, and they should come see him on Monday to begin the arrangements. Sarah stood in the middle of it all and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was belonging. Not the polite belonging of a newcomer being accepted, but the real thing, the sense of being genuinely woven into a place and a community, of mattering to people who were not obligated to care. She had not known, coming off that stagecoach in July, that this was what she was coming to. She had thought she was coming to a job in a room above her aunt's store and the chance to make something of herself on her own terms. She had done all of those things, and she had also found this. She looked across the room at Benjamin, who was talking to Pete and the other ranch hands, and he caught her eye over the heads of the people between them and smiled, the particular smile that was only for her, the one that did not appear in company or conversation, but only in these private moments that happened to occur in public, and she smiled back with the same particular quality, and the room between them felt full of something warm and real. The months between the engagement and the wedding were busy ones. The spring planting was underway on the Dalton ranch by March, and Sarah was deep in the school year, and the arrangements for the wedding were added to both their lives as a happy kind of extra work. There was a dress to be made, and Martha took charge of that with the authority of someone who had been waiting years for the opportunity. There were guests to be notified, including Benjamin's family in Kentucky, 3 of whom had written back immediately to say they would make the journey. There was the matter of where Sarah would live after the wedding, which was answered easily and obviously by the Dalton ranch, 4 miles east of town, which meant Sarah would need to ride into school each day or keep a horse of her own, and Benjamin resolved this by beginning immediately to teach her to ride better than she currently did, which was to say competently but not confidently. They rode together in the evenings when the light was long, and the Texas spring made the land beautiful in a way that was almost theatrical, the wildflowers coming up across the plain in sweeps of color that Sarah tried repeatedly, and somewhat unsuccessfully, to describe in letters home to distant cousins back east. Benjamin was a patient teacher, which did not entirely surprise her, and she was a quick learner, which did not entirely surprise him, and by April she was riding with the easy confidence of someone who had found a physical skill that suited her. It was during one of these evening rides in April that Clifton Rourke made one final attempt at the land he had been after. He had, it turned out, filed a legal challenge in Austin, and the county had received notice of a hearing to be scheduled for June. Benjamin had been advised of this by lawyer Abernathy, who had been working on the documentation with him and the other ranchers since December. The hearing itself was not immediately alarming, because the paperwork they had assembled was solid, but it required time and attention and coordination, and Benjamin carried the weight of it with the same quiet, methodical determination he brought to everything. Sarah helped where she could, organizing the ranchers' records in the evenings at the kitchen table of the ranch house, a task that had the comfortable intimacy of 2 people working together in a shared space toward a shared goal. Consuela fed them and expressed her opinion of Clifton Rourke in Spanish with an expressiveness that required no translation. Pete and the other ranch hands offered to be character witnesses if needed, which Benjamin thanked them for with genuine warmth. The hearing happened in early June in the county seat, and Benjamin went with Abernathy and Tom Garrett and 2 other ranchers, and they were gone for 3 days. And Sarah taught school and helped Martha in the store and worked very hard not to spend more than a reasonable portion of each day thinking about how the hearing was going. He came back on a Thursday afternoon, and she saw him riding down the main street from the schoolhouse window and excused herself 3 minutes before the school day was officially over with an instruction to the older children to supervise the younger one's dismissal, which they managed adequately. She met him at the hitching post outside the store, and the look on his face told her before he said a word. "Rourke's claim was denied," he said, swinging down from his horse. "All of it. The judge found his survey documentation was fraudulent. He's being investigated by the land office now." Sarah put her arms around him, right there on the main street, because she was not a woman who saved her emotions for private moments when public ones were better suited, and he laughed and held her back, and Martha appeared in the doorway of the store with a wide smile and immediately began preparing a celebratory dinner. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of July, which was almost exactly 1 year after Sarah had stepped off the stagecoach and into Callow Creek, and into a life that was nothing like what she had planned and better than what she had imagined. The week before the wedding had a dreamlike quality that Sarah would later look back on with great tenderness. The dress was finished, cream-colored muslin with careful embroidery at the cuffs and collar that Martha had worked on in the evenings for 3 months. Benjamin's mother, Ellen Dalton, had arrived from Kentucky with her eldest son James and his wife Caroline, and she was a small, bright-eyed woman who took one look at Sarah and said, "Well, I can see what he's talking about," and embraced her with the warmth of someone who had been hoping for this for a while. His older brother James was quiet and solid in the way that Benjamin was, and Caroline was lively and funny and became friends with Sarah within about 40 minutes of meeting her. The church was decorated on the Friday with wildflowers that the schoolchildren had gathered, because Sarah's students had been collectively determined to be involved in some aspect of the wedding, and the result was charmingly imperfect and beautiful. On Saturday morning, Sarah stood in Martha's back room in her cream dress with her hair done up properly for once and looked at herself in the mirror, and Martha stood behind her and put her hands on Sarah's shoulders and looked at her reflection with an expression that was full of love. "Your father would have been so proud of you," Martha said softly. Sarah took a breath. "I know," she said. "I feel like he knows it somehow." Martha squeezed her shoulders. "He does," she said firmly, in the tone of a woman who has decided to be certain about this and will not be argued with. The church was full. Callow Creek had turned out entirely, which was not surprising because Callow Creek was exactly the kind of place where it would. Benjamin stood at the front in a dark coat and clean white shirt and looked, when Sarah appeared in the doorway, at her with an expression that made Reverend Calloway have to wait a full 15 seconds before anyone was in a condition to proceed. Sarah walked down the aisle on Martha's arm, because Martha was the closest thing she had to family present, and she walked steadily and looked at Benjamin the whole way, and the look on his face was so open and so full and so entirely without pretense that she felt it in her chest like a bell being struck. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony with a warmth and brevity that struck exactly the right note, and when he came to the part about the vows, Benjamin said his with a clarity and steadiness that made the whole church quiet, every word deliberate and meant, and Sarah said hers looking directly at him without wavering, because she had never been more certain of anything in her life. When Reverend Calloway said that Benjamin might kiss his bride, there was a moment, brief and complete, where they simply looked at each other and let the fullness of it land before he leaned in and kissed her with the particular tenderness of a person who is treating something as precious. The church erupted in the good noise of a happy community, and they turned and walked back down the aisle as Benjamin and Sarah Dalton, And the July sun outside was everything. The big open Texas sky above the town and the heat, and the wildflowers along the road, and the people they had come to love surrounding them on all sides. The celebration lasted the whole afternoon and into the evening, and there was food that seemed to appear from everywhere, because in Callow Creek when there was a wedding the whole town fed it, and there was dancing and considerable happiness, and the kind of noise that means everything is all right. Benjamin and Sarah danced together more than twice, because they were married now and propriety had a different set of rules, and he was a good dancer, and she was becoming a better one with practice. And there was a particular moment in the later evening when the crowd had thinned slightly, and the music had gone slow and quiet, when they danced in the middle of the floor with the lantern light warm around them and no particular awareness of anyone else present. And Sarah thought that this was what it felt like to be exactly where you were supposed to be. They drove out to the ranch that night in Benjamin's wagon under a wide, clear sky full of the particular density of stars that you can only see far from any city, and the air was warm and smelled of summer grass, and Sarah sat close beside him on the wagon seat and felt the solid warmth of his arm against hers, and the happiness in her chest that was quiet and enormous and thoroughly real. "Hello, Mrs. Dalton," he said, as the lights of Callow Creek disappeared behind them. "Hello, Mr. Dalton," she said, and leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and the horse walked on through the summer dark. The ranch became hers as naturally and completely as though she had always been there. She brought her books and her teaching things and her modest collection of clothes and personal items, and Consuela received her with the warmth of someone who has been holding a space open and is glad to see it filled. The east bedroom became theirs, the one with the morning light, and Sarah arranged her books on the shelf Benjamin had built for that purpose and put her writing things on the desk by the window, and it did not take long at all before the space felt entirely like home. She continued teaching through the fall, riding into town each morning on the gray mare Benjamin had helped her choose, a steady, sensible horse that the children of Callow Creek collectively adored and named Pearl without consulting either of her owners. The 4 miles were beautiful in the autumn light, and she rode them with a pleasure that was part physical and part the simple happiness of moving through a landscape she had grown to love. Benjamin rode with her on the mornings when the ranch work allowed it, and on those mornings the ride took longer than strictly necessary, because there was much to talk about and the land was beautiful, and there was no good reason to hurry. Life on the Dalton ranch had a rhythm and a fullness that Sarah had not anticipated and found deeply satisfying. The work of a ranch, even for the wife of its owner, was real and substantial, and she was not a woman who wanted to be ornamental. She learned what Consuela could teach her about keeping a ranch house, the particular practicalities of cooking for working men, and keeping a kitchen garden, and managing the 1,000 small domestic logistics of a place that was also a working operation. She contributed to the accounts, because her head for numbers was considerably better than Benjamin's, and she reorganized his record-keeping with an efficiency that made his quarterly reconciliations go from a dreaded afternoon to a manageable one. She was happy in a way that was not the narrow, breathless happiness of the early months, but the broad, sturdy happiness of a life that was genuinely good, built on real things and real love. In November, about 4 months after the wedding, she told him she thought she might be expecting, and the look on his face was one she had not seen before, a depth and a brightness together that made him look for a moment very young and very much in awe. He held her hands and asked her several practical questions because he was a practical man, and then he put his arms around her and held her there in the kitchen of the ranch house while the evening light came through the windows and Consuela pretended to be busy on the other side of the room, and he said very quietly, "I did not think I could be any luckier than I already was." "We're both lucky," Sarah said. "Yes," he said, "we are." She told Martha the next Sunday at the store, and Martha sat down on a flour sack and cried, which was the second most Martha Prout thing Sarah had ever seen, the first being the tears at the engagement. She gathered herself within a minute and immediately began discussing practical preparations with an energy that was going to sustain them both through the spring. The pregnancy was not easy in the early months. Sarah was genuinely unwell through December and January in the particular way that some women are, though she taught school as long as she reasonably could and managed the ranch accounts from the kitchen table even on the bad days, because she was constitutionally unable to simply sit and do nothing. Benjamin was a presence throughout this that she found she could not do without, patient and practical, and undeflected by her occasional irritability, bringing her the particular things that helped and simply being there in the way that good people are when other people need them. By February she was better, and by March she felt well, and the spring that year had the particularly beautiful quality of a season arriving in a year when beauty had been earning its meaning. Her students presented her with a quilt in April, made by their mothers from fabric collected across the town, each square containing something: a child's handprint pressed in ink, a small embroidered name, a cutout from a dress that had belonged to someone's grandmother. Sarah held it in front of the whole school and was unable to speak for a moment, which was unusual for her, and the children looked at her with the earnest anxiety of young people waiting to find out if they have done something right. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me," she managed, and by the satisfied expressions on her students' faces, that was clearly exactly the right thing to say. The school year ended in May, and she stepped back from teaching for the summer to allow her body the quiet it was asking for. Another teacher would come in the fall to cover her absence, a young woman from San Antonio named Miss Reeves, whom Sarah had helped hire through correspondence with the county, and Sarah felt comfortable leaving her students in those hands. The summer of 1876 in Callow Creek moved slowly through the heat, and Sarah spent much of it on the ranch's covered porch in the evenings with Benjamin beside her, reading or talking or simply sitting in the comfortable silence of two people who are entirely at ease in each other's presence. Consuela made particular things for Sarah's particular cravings, which changed weekly, and which Consuela navigated with the unflappable expertise of a woman who had produced 4 children of her own. Pete and the ranch hands treated Sarah with a collective protective care that she found both amusing and genuinely touching. The baby came in late July, on a Saturday when the heat was enormous and the sky was the white blue of full summer, and it was a boy, healthy and loud, and absolutely convinced that his opinion on the matter of being born should be heard immediately and at length. Benjamin was there for all of it, which was not universally practiced among men of the time and place, but which he had decided upon without much deliberation, because the idea of being anywhere else was simply not something he was willing to consider. He held Sarah's hand through the long hours and talked to her and brought her water, and generally made himself as useful as a man in those circumstances could be, which, according to Dr. Brower, was more than most, and when the baby arrived and was placed in Sarah's arms and he looked at his son for the first time, the expression on his face was something Sarah stored away in the deepest part of her memory, where she kept the things that were too important to risk losing. They named him Thomas John Dalton. Thomas for Tom Garrett, who had been a good friend and neighbor. John for Sarah's father, whose middle name it had been and whose memory she carried with her everywhere. Martha came out to the ranch within the hour, her wagon moving at a pace that suggested she had not entirely obeyed the traffic customs of the road, and she held the baby for approximately 40 minutes without putting him down, and talked to him continuously in the low, warm voice she reserved for people and creatures she loved completely. Thomas John Dalton was, from his first days, a person of considerable personality. He was curious and vocal and thoroughly interested in everything within his range of perception, and his parents were besotted with him in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of people who are genuinely good at love. In the fall, Sarah returned to teaching part-time, 3 days a week, leaving Thomas in Consuela's expert care, and the rhythm of her life expanded to include this new dimension without losing any of its previous richness. She was a mother and a teacher and a wife and a rancher's partner, and a reader of books and a rider of gray mares, and a member of the community of Callow Creek. And all of these things existed together as naturally as chapters in a coherent story. The years that followed had the quality of genuine accumulation, the particular richness that comes from a life lived with intention and in the right place with the right people. Benjamin expanded the ranch gradually and carefully, adding acreage as it became available, and as the finances supported it, building with the same steady patience he brought to everything. Sarah continued teaching and became, over the years, a fixture of Callow Creek's civic life, serving on the school board and helping to establish a small lending library from her own collection and donations from the town. She and Martha ran a women's literacy group that met on Wednesday evenings, because Sarah had grown up knowing what a difference it made to have access to reading and ideas, and was not inclined to keep that advantage to herself. They had a second child 3 years after Thomas, a girl they named Ellen Martha, Ellen for Benjamin's mother, who had become a beloved presence in their lives through annual visits and warm letters, and Martha because there was really only one choice for the second name given the woman who had written the letter that had started everything. Ellen Martha was, from her first breath, entirely different from her brother, quieter and more internally focused and possessed of the particular kind of observation that suggested she was always thinking about twice as much as she showed. Thomas adored his sister with the uncomplicated wholeheartedness of a big brother who has not yet learned to be anything other than thoroughly affectionate, and she regarded him with the tolerant affection of someone who finds another person somewhat exhausting but genuinely worthwhile. The life that unfolded over those years in Callow Creek and on the Dalton Ranch was not without its difficulties, because no real life is. There were bad cattle seasons and hard winters, and the ordinary accumulation of losses and challenges that time brings to everyone. Benjamin's father passed away in Kentucky when Thomas was 4, and Benjamin made the journey home alone to say goodbye and came back quieter and fuller of something that took several months to fully process. Sarah's distant cousin, the last of her family back in Missouri, wrote to say she was moving further east, and the letter had a finality to it that Sarah sat with for a day before putting it down and getting on with things. There was a prairie fire in the summer of 1879 that came within 2 miles of the ranch before the wind shifted and the volunteer fire line held. There were disagreements because 2 people of strong character and independent minds will have them, and theirs were the productive kind, the type that required both of them to actually listen and sometimes to change their minds, which they were both, after their initial and characteristic stubbornness, capable of doing. But the difficulties were the context for everything else, not the substance of it. The substance of it was the life itself, the good, ordinary daily reality of the ranch and the town and the children and the work, and the man and the woman at the center of it, who had found each other with the help of a letter written in the fall of 1873 and made something real and lasting out of what might have been nothing. When Thomas was 7 and Ellen Martha was 4, Sarah wrote a long letter to her father's grave, which she had not been able to visit since she was 21, and in it she told him everything. She told him about Callow Creek and the schoolhouse and Martha's store. She told him about Benjamin, taking her time with that description because he was worth taking time with. She told him about the ring on the main street in the January cold and the whole town cheering. She told him about the church wedding and the ranch and Consuela's tamales and Pearl the gray mare and the students who had made her a quilt. She told him about Thomas, who had his grandfather's name, and she suspected, his grandfather's love of asking questions. She told him about Ellen Martha, who observed the world with a gravity that made Sarah think of her father's best qualities. She told him she was happy. Not the fragile happiness of someone lucky enough to have avoided misfortune, but the solid, substantive happiness of someone who had built something real in partnership with another person, who was genuinely worth building with. She folded the letter and kept it in the book he had given her, the collected essays of a naturalist that sat on the shelf beside Benjamin's natural history book, the one that had come wrapped in brown paper and tied with string with her name written in his clear, careful hand. In 1880, when Thomas Dalton was 4 years old and had recently developed the habit of following Pete around the barn asking questions about horses with a single-mindedness that Pete bore with impressive patience, and Ellen Martha was a 1-year-old with opinions about everything she could observe, Sarah walked out onto the porch one evening to find Benjamin sitting with a look on his face that she had learned, over their years together, to recognize as the look of a man thinking about something large. She sat beside him and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, the way she always did, and they looked out at the land together in the fading light. The summer was long and gold out there, the grass moving in the evening wind, the cattle in the far field dark shapes against the horizon, the sky above everything doing what the Texas sky did, which was to be enormous and impossible and full of more color than seemed strictly necessary. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "This," he said. "The porch, all of it," he said quietly. "The ranch, you, the children, what it is, what it has become." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep waiting to get accustomed to it, and I never quite do. Every time I look at it, it still seems like more than I expected." Sarah looked out at the land they had built together, the ground he had broken alone and she had arrived to find, and they had grown together, the place where their children were learning to walk and talk and think, the community of Callow Creek a few miles west with its church and its school and its people who had become theirs. "I think that means you appreciate it properly," she said. "I think the people who get accustomed to the good things are the ones who eventually stop seeing them." He looked at her, the way he still looked at her after all the years, with that particular directness and warmth that had been the same since the afternoon in the storeroom when he had first asked if he might call on her. "When did you get to be so wise?" he asked. "I have always been this wise," she said. "You simply had to catch up." He laughed, the low, unguarded laugh that she had loved from the first time she heard it, and pulled her closer, and they sat together on the porch in the long summer evening, while the children slept inside and Consuela moved in the kitchen, and the land spread out before them in the warm last light. There were so many more evenings like that one ahead. So many more mornings with the east light coming through the bedroom window and the sounds of the ranch coming alive outside. So many more rides to town on Pearl, with the sky wide above and the grass alive with wind. So many more Sundays in the church at Callow Creek where they had stood together and promised each other everything, and kept every promise. So many more conversations at the kitchen table late at night, with the lamp burning low between them, and the particular intimacy of two people who know each other so deeply that silence itself is a form of communication. So many more of Thomas's urgent questions and Ellen Martha's thoughtful ones. So many more of Martha's opinions and Consuela's tamales and Pete's patient expertise with horses, and the good, loyal community of the town that had taken them in and let them belong. Benjamin Dalton had come to Texas from Kentucky at 22 with nothing but determination and a deep willingness to work, and he had built a real thing on real ground. And Sarah Turner had come to Callow Creek, Texas, on a stagecoach in the July dust of 1874, thinner than her mother had been and carrying a single leather trunk and the quiet resolution of someone who intended to make something of themselves regardless of what the world thought about it. She had made something of herself. They had made something of themselves together, which was, as it turned out, the better version of the plan. The ring he had placed on her finger on that cold January afternoon, in front of the whole town, before he had even finished asking, caught the last of the evening light as she sat with her hand in his on the porch of the ranch they had built and loved and filled with living, and it glowed the particular warm gold of something that has been worn for years and has taken on the quality of the life it has accompanied. "Good night, Benjamin," she said, much later, when the stars had come out and the house was quiet and the land around them was full of the summer dark and the thousand sounds of a living world. "Good night, Sarah," he said, and in the way he said her name was everything he had ever meant and meant still and would go on meaning. The history of them, the January proposal and the yes before the asking was finished. The church and the vows and the years of work and laughter and love, and the children sleeping inside, and the land spread out around them, and the whole long, beautiful, improbable good reality of a life that had been built on a single letter written by a small, round woman with iron-gray hair who had known, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what she was doing when she set it all in motion. The porch was quiet, and the stars above Callow Creek were everything, and the night was warm and real and entirely their own.